Welcome to All Access, where we meet at the intersection of healthcare and generic and biosimilar medications. Brought to you by the Association for Accessible Medicines, representing the generics and biosimilars industry. And I'm just thrilled today to hear from Avik Roy, who is one of the most powerful speakers on the importance of competition and competition on behalf of and what real world competition does for consumers and what it does for, in our case, prices of medicine. And that's our mission every day, is to make sure that we are here to provide access for affordable medicines for patients. And Avik has thought a lot about this, written a lot about this, and we're just thrilled to have him. So at that, I would like to again thank everybody for joining. As Sarah said, we want to have a robust Q&A. So, throughout the course of Avik's talk, shoot your questions in the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric.
Great, thanks, Dan. Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome and introduce today's guest speaker, Avik Roy. As Dan mentioned, when we created Allies, Thinkers, and Scribes, we really did so as a means to connect our industry with thought leaders and to build and develop a relationship between those leaders and AAM's members. And our goal was to try to bring you an ally, a thinker, or a scribe each month. But in today's case, we are joined by someone who is all three. For more than a decade, Avik's been an influential voice in each of the major healthcare debates. In 2009, he started The Apothecary, an influential blog on healthcare that's now part of Forbes. In 2012, he served as healthcare policy advisor to Mitt Romney's presidential campaign. In 2015 and 2016, he advised the presidential campaigns of Rick Perry and Marco Rubio. He's been called the go-to policy wonk on healthcare and has released numerous policy papers, penned op-eds, and been a frequent guest on cable and national news networks. In his current role as the president of FREOPP, where he's focused on the importance of competition and the value of the free market, Avik has helped shape the national conversation on prescription drug policy. He's authored The Competition Prescription, a market-based plan for affordable drugs, and what Medicare can learn from other countries on drug pricing. Both of these reports speak to the value of patient access to generic and biosimilar medicines, the barriers that exist today to competition, and offer, his thoughts and solutions on steps that the FDA, HHS, and Congress can take to lower prescription drug costs. He's seen by the Hill and by folks in the administration as an influential voice in the prescription drug reform debate. His policy ideas have been used and cited by many on Capitol Hill, as well as were formational as part of Secretary HHS Secretary Alex Azar's policy blueprint. An MIT-trained scientist and a graduate of the Yale Medical School, Avik's public policy views and analysis are informed by those experiences, as well as the 12 years he spent as an investor in emerging pharmaceutical and biotech companies. Avik lives in Austin, Texas, where he is joining us from today with his wife and 2 children. Avik, really, thank you again for joining us. I will now yield the floor to you.
Well, thanks, Eric, and it's really great to be here with all of you. As Eric mentioned, I've observed this industry from a number of different angles. First, as someone who was an aspiring but ultimately failed scientist, and then as an investor, where I obviously came to really appreciate how hard innovation is and how important it is, but also the strategies that that branded companies will deploy to preserve their exclusivities and monopolies, even when they're due to run out. Something we followed obviously very closely as investors in publicly traded profitable companies. And now as a policy analyst, thinker, writer, whatever you want to call it, scribe, I'm happy to learn from all of you. I'm looking forward to the Q&A portion of this talk, because obviously I've written a lot about this topic, but what I really value is the feedback from those of you who are practitioners, who are trying every day to make prescription drugs more affordable through competition. You are so essential to this debate, an underappreciated part of this debate, I would say. You probably would too. And so I'm going to be really grateful for your feedback, whether it's today or in the ensuing months and years. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me if you've got some thoughts on things we could do to leverage your hard work to make sure that more and more patients can afford their medicines. With that, I'm going to put some slides up. Forgive me, because I know some of this stuff is going to be stuff you already know, but it's just sort of some table setting data around where we are in the prescription drug competition landscape and policy landscape. So I'm going to share my screen here and go through a couple of charts, or a dozen charts or so, and then we'll see where we end up and take the conversation wherever you'd like to go. So just some background on the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, or FREOPP, which is my think tank that's headquartered in Austin, but also with offices in Washington. We are a standard think tank by structure, a nonprofit, nonpartisan 501c3. What's unique about us is that we are trying to achieve progressive policy outcomes through free market means. So, too often in DC debates or policy debates in general, it's a zero-sum game. The other side has to lose for me to win. We look at it as a positive sum game. We look at it as the work that you all do to bring competition to prescription drug markets, for example, is something that can achieve the progressive policy outcome of more affordable, universally affordable medicines and healthcare. That's not just true in drugs or in healthcare, it's true in a lot of areas. It's true in housing, it's true in energy policy, it's true in financial services, it's true in education, it's true in criminal justice reform. There are a lot of areas where expanding the scope of competition and economic and personal freedom can lead to more opportunity for lower income Americans. So we exclusively focus on policy ideas for reform that materially improve the lives of Americans whose incomes or wealth are below the US median. In that way, we try to bring Democrats and Republicans together to get through that 60 vote threshold in the Senate to achieve real change and not merely splitting the difference between the two parties. So to the topic at hand, as you all know, one thing you'll hear people say, well, prescription drugs aren't such a big deal. Prescription drug prices are not a big deal. It's only 8% of prescription spending, according to official government statistics. That's wrong for a number of reasons. But the most relevant for today is that if you're part of the non-elderly population that gets private insurance, it's more like a quarter of your spend is prescription drugs. It's actually the second highest component of your insurance premiums is prescription drugs. And so let's dig into a little bit what are the components of the prescription drug spend. Before that, you all know this, but it's always worth reminding people that the prescription drug crisis in America has, there are some positive elements of the way we do prescription drugs in the US. We are the most efficient country in the world at substituting unbranded generic drugs for branded prescription drugs where it is appropriate to do so. Far better than our friends in other advanced industrial economies. And that's, again, something that you all know, but doesn't get cited enough as part of the good story of the US prescription drug system. We're actually, where competition is allowed, we're actually very good at utilizing it to bring costs down. Here's another way to think about it. So if you take invoice sales, so that's pre-rebate sales for prescription drugs, what you'll see here is both branded generics and unbranded generic spend is roughly stable over much of this decade, right? But where's all the spending increase going? It's going to patented branded drugs. So if you just look at patented branded drugs alone, invoice spending has gone up by 67% over a 6-year time frame. And I promise you that the cost of innovation has not gone up 67% in 6 years. So what's going on here? Well, a big part of it is the rise of biologic drugs. So if you look at small molecules alone, so you'll hear a lot of people in the policy conversation talk about specialty drugs versus non-specialty drugs, right? I'm gonna use a more objective or legal standard, which is small molecules governed by Hatch-Waxman and biologic drugs now governed by the Biologics Price Competition Innovation Act of 2009, or Title VII of the Affordable Care Act. And if you actually compare those legal regimes and the drugs who fall under each legal bucket, so small molecules and biologics, small molecule spending net of rebates is actually declined over the last several years. Think about that, right? Pretty remarkable achievement that never gets talked about. We always talk about this crisis in drug spending, but so why aren't we celebrating the good news of the fact that net drug spending on small molecules, and this is not inflation adjusted data, this is nominal data, right? So even on an inflation adjusted basis, it's even better. We have actually had declining spending over the last several years. But here's what's happened with biologic spending. Biologic spending has almost doubled from 2013 to now, to the point where now biologic spending is nearly, and will be probably in 2022, the majority of spending net of rebates on prescription drugs in the United States. And that's relevant, as you all know, because the regime of competition in the biologic space is very different than that for small molecules. And let me hammer this point home as heavily as I can here. So as per the last chart, as of the most recent IQVIA data set we have, which is 2019, or at least that I have, you guys probably have more up-to-date data than that. But in terms of the public domain data, small molecules were 52% of net drug spending in 2019, and biologics were 48%. But biologics represented 0.4% of prescription volume in 2019. Now that is just astounding, right? Think about that for a second. 0.4% of US prescription volume accounts for 48% of net drug spending. That is astounding, right? And that highlights the issue and the problem of competition, right? Because again, as you all know, for all the kind of relative, the complaints you might have about the Hatch-Waxman regime, the things we got to tweak here or there about Hatch-Waxman, Hatch-Waxman overall works a heck of a lot better than the system that we have for biosimilars today. Here's another way to think about that piece specifically, right? So branded biologic spending has continued to rise. And while we're making progress on the biosimilars front, and I'm sure I'll hear from some of you that we're making even more progress in upcoming years, and there's more reason to be at least somewhat optimistic that we're getting some traction here. The progress has been very slow. And that the optimistic case, Scott Gottlieb, who's a friend of mine, will often tell me, he's like, oh, it's just like Hatch-Waxman. It'll get going, and after a few years, it'll be like, the big explosion of generic substitution we saw in, say, the 2000s. It took a while for all these things to get going, but once they did, everything was fine. And Scott would argue that that's going to be true with biosimilars. The biosimilars will eventually take off and will have the same impact on the biologics space as small molecule generics did for branded small molecules. I am not as optimistic about that. And the reason is that when the Biologics Price Competition Innovation Act was developed by Congress in 2009, 2010, the branded incumbent industry learned a lot from Hatch-Waxman and put provisions in the new bill, the biologics bill, to gum up the works and make it a lot harder for the same kind of competition to evolve in biosimilars. And again, those of you who are directly involved in the biosimilar space, I don't need to tell you this stuff, right? You know it, you're living it, right? Between the phase 3 clinical trials you have to do to prove therapeutic equivalence, to the higher manufacturing costs, to the blizzard of patents that you have to navigate in a way that's far more difficult than the Hatch-Waxman Orange Book process. Those are the three biggest areas, and there are others that we can talk about, but it's just a completely different game. And let me talk about one other element of the competition problem that is relevant and underlies some of this stuff particularly on the biologic side, which is, you hear a lot of talk about, well, we got to have high prices, because if we don't have high prices, we won't have innovation. But those of you who spent time in the branded pharmaceutical or biotech space, you know that R&D is not a unit, right? Different types of drugs cost different amounts to develop. If you're developing a drug for diabetes let's start with this. If you're dealing with a drug for an ultra rare disorder, which has a US prevalence of 1,750 people, right? So less than 1% of 0.1% of the population, 0.05% of the population. You're dealing with a drug that has a prevalence in the US of 1,750 people. Your clinical trial costs are relatively low, right? Because there are only so many patients around to enroll in those studies. And clinical trial costs, particularly at the phase 3 level, are a function of how many patients you enroll in the studies to a large degree. And the FDA is also more lenient because it's like, well, it's a rare disease. Very few people are going to get this drug. They're not going to push you to do massively large trials because of that factor, along with just the enrollment logistics issues, right? So from a sweet spot standpoint, if you're a drug company, it used to be 20 years ago, you couldn't charge allotted money per patient per year for those drugs. Now you can. Routinely, these ultra orphan drugs are getting $1 billion a year revenue. It used to be that you couldn't do that, right? The business model of the large pharmaceutical industry in the late 90s and early 2000s was you could only work on big diseases like hypercholesterolemia or hypertension or diabetes, because that was the only way you could get $1 billion drug, because you had to have that many patients to get $1 billion drug, right? Now that's no longer true. Now you can get $1 billion drug off a disease that has a prevalence of 1,750 people. So that is the sweet spot. If you're a venture capitalist or a new startup drug company, or even a big company, what do you want to do? You want to develop a drug. Sorry, I didn't hear that. I don't know if that was a question or just a comment. You want to develop a drug where there's a low R&D costs and high pricing power. What you don't want to do is develop drugs for diabetes. You're basically a chump if you develop drugs for diabetes, because those drugs are very expensive on the R&D front. You have to do 5-year cardiovascular safety studies on 20,000 patients, which literally costs like $2-3 billion to do those kind of trials. And you're competing against all those wonderful off-patent drugs like metformin that you find folks make, right? So price competition is working. It keeps the price of those drugs low for patients. The flip side is there's no incentive, or very little of an incentive, to develop new drugs in those diseases because the regulatory hurdles and costs are so high. And as a result, we're seeing orphan drugs eat up a larger amount of the spend. We're at a point now where orphan drug spending is 1/3 of the overall spending on US prescription drugs. So to tie all this together, the two trends that we're seeing a trend towards biologics, because that's an area where competition is obstructed by laws passed by Congress and regulations enacted by the FDA. And we're seeing a proliferation of orphan drugs, where there's a sweet spot in terms of R&D expenditure relative to that monopoly and anti-competitive element. Or, if you're the innovator, you like that, you want that moat around your drug. It's a lot harder to have 10 generics for an ultra rare drug because the market isn't big enough in theory to do that. So people see that as a more sustainable business model, right? So where are we in the policy debate, right? We're touching on some of this stuff. If you think about the Senate Finance Committee bill from 2019, which is almost certainly going to get resuscitated at some point in this Congress by Ron Wyden and others, there's some attention being placed on the fact that Part B physicians are basically real estate brokers who get a 6% commission or a 4.3% commission on the drugs they prescribe, which basically disincentivizes them from prescribing your products because they get a smaller commission for doing so. And the fact that they are effectively coverage mandates, both in B and D, right? That where you have to pay for drugs regardless of their price or value as a payer. And that means there's no incentive to have price competition, right? And ASP itself is not a market price. And there's also the switching strategies, which you all are aware of and deal with a lot. As older drugs come off patent. All these things are gameable, especially in Part B, and are attracting more attention. And I think one way to quantify this is the contribution of older drugs to rising prices. And this was a study that was done of the UPM's University of Pittsburgh Medical Center Health Plan. Look at, okay, of our drug spend, what are the drivers of rising pharmacy costs? And it was older drugs. Right? Drugs that are more than 3 years old, where they're already entrenched, they're already in the patient. Once they're in the patient, getting the patient to try something else is really hard. Those first 3 years of the launch, however, you don't see a lot of aggressive price increases because that's where the payers can come in and say, hey, we'll do the prior auth, we'll put you on tier 3 or tier 5 or whatever, right? So drug companies generally tend to try to keep their launch prices competitive, or at least competitive enough that the payer uptake will be there. And then once the drug is in patients, this is another example of where competition doesn't work, right? So if you've got a drug that 20,000 people are taking, physicians are very reluctant. It's a standard kind of thing about physician care. If you're well managed on a particular drug, you don't want to switch to another drug. And the problem with that's a good thing. That's an understandable point of view from a standpoint of a clinician in clinical practice. But the problem from a standpoint of the affordability of drugs is the branded companies recognize that and take advantage of that to raise prices, knowing that someone is already attached to the drugs that they're well managed on. And that makes it harder for folks like yourselves to break in, as you know. So what are some of the things we can do, and what are some of the things we're considering? We can reform the ASP plus real estate broker model for paying physicians for drugs. We can do more to incentivize price competition for therapeutically similar drugs like Europeans often do. We can peg reimbursement growth in Medicare to CPI, something the Senate Finance Committee has considered. We can eliminate the mandate that Medicare pay for all drugs regardless of quality, price, or value. This is obviously something that becomes controversial because the pharmaceutical companies will say, hey, that means there's not going to be access to my drug. But if you require Medicare to cover every single drug, but you don't give Medicare the ability to negotiate prices in Part B, then what do? You create a recipe for massive inflation because drug companies know they can charge whatever they want. You could integrate A, B into D, where at least some of those market forces are more present, or you can benchmark Part B rates and Medicare rates and Medicaid rates to other countries where the above principles are applied. Now, if you do that, of course, you'll hear the branded companies say, well, then there won't be access to new drugs. But that's not exactly true. If we look at statistics and data in terms of market access, we see those countries on the top left are the countries that have the fastest access to newly developed drugs in Europe. It's Germany, the UK, Denmark, and Sweden. Some of that is in the case of Germany and the UK. These are the largest markets in Europe, and generally branded companies want to go in the largest market first, just like you guys do. But part of it is their reimbursement strategies, which are we give you free pricing in year 1, and then after that, we start to examine the cost effectiveness of these drugs and try to negotiate more aggressively after that. That allows the launch to happen pretty rapidly, but then you start to look at the real world experience with those drugs in order to have a fairer price, you could say. And so that's a technique that Germany and the UK use pretty successfully that we could learn from. Now, those are some of the things that people are talking about in Congress. Let's talk about some of the things that Congress is not talking about, but that are very important to your business models. One is the clinical development costs, right? The fact that you have to do these phase 3 trials. I mean, I guess once you get through all that, I appreciate that. Once you've done all that work, you have a kind of a moat around your business as a biosimilar, and that can be a business model advantage. But from the standpoint of patients who want more competitors and lower costs, the high cost of R&Ds for biosimilars is a real problem because it means that to recoup those costs, you have to charge higher prices for your drugs than you otherwise would. There's the rebate wall problem, which we can get into, and again, would love your insights on particular tactics that you're seeing out there that make it hard for biologic competition to take place. There's the manufacturing costs. My hope is that over time, we're going to get better at optimizing for the manufacturing costs of biologics. But part of this is regulatory nature, and we've got to do smart thinking about how to fine-tune the way the FDA regulates the ramp-up of manufacturing with biologics. One thing I've thought about and would love your feedback on is, what if we held biosimilar manufacturers to the same standards that we hold branded biologic manufacturers to when they build a new plant? So Genzyme builds a new plant to produce Fabrizyme or whatever. You know, whatever standard the FDA is asking them to uphold for their new plant, why isn't that the standard that we hold biosimilars to, instead of all the extra stuff that we hold biosimilars to that drive up the cost? And then the patent trolling problem, right? This is the thorniest problem of it all. Like the AbbVie situation where you've got 75 or 100 patents for adalimumab. It reminds me of the old Irish Republican Army line. So, the Irish Republican Army tried many times to assassinate Margaret Thatcher, and they got really close one time at the Conservative Party conference, which is the equivalent of the Republican National Convention. They bombed her hotel and almost barely missed. Like, they got her bathroom, but not her living room or something like that. And she survived without a scratch, or maybe a couple scratches. And afterwards, the IRA said to Margaret Thatcher, you have to be lucky every time we try to kill you. We only have to be lucky once. And that's how patent trolling works, right? Like, AbbVie can throw every single patent on the board, and even if they throw out 75 and 74 get knocked out, but there's one still left, they win, right? And that's obviously a huge problem from a policy standpoint. And how do we think about reforming both patent law and the way the USPTO kind of unthinkingly issues these patents? Or maybe it's simply just having a more Orange Book style approach to which patents are enforceable. Or maybe it's some other way of rethinking the way market exclusivity works for biologics, where there's a hard cap on the amount of exclusivity you have, for example. There are a lot of ways to think about this, but that to me is one of the stickiest problems, because reforming patent law is an incredibly tough political fight, but one that's very important if we're going to make biologic medicines more affordable over time. So with that, good luck, and I welcome your thoughts. Thank you very much. And if you want to hear more about our work, you can go to FREOPP.org, which is our overall website, to hear about all the other things that we're doing. And if you want to look at our drug stuff specifically, FREOPP.org/drugs/home. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thank you, Avik. That's great presentation, great data, so much to talk about and to dig into. But I'll start, and then I just want to make sure people know that you can send a question through the chat or raise your hand, and we'll get to you. But I will be pummeled by my own team if I don't let you know that your data on your very first slide has been updated. This is you had the 2018 data that shows 86% of prescriptions written are generic. Is now 90%. It's our most recent data, which came out relatively recently. So we'll make sure.
Yeah, send me that. I always have to pull teeth to get Murray at IQVIA to send me his latest data. So
we'll get it from us.
Please feel free.
We have a lot more teeth on this team here, but we'll get that to you. 90% of the prescriptions written, 20% of the overall cost. So that goes right into the message, and the data that you showed on biosimilars is even more dramatic. But I'll start with on the small molecule side. So 90% of the prescriptions, 20% of the cost. If next year it's 92.18, that's a great policy message. We would talk about that on the Hill all day long and to patients, but we're talking to the business leaders here today. That's not a great place for our guys to be on the business side. The sustainability of that business model is very, very difficult. And I think we've seen a lot of power in the hands of few, and the consolidation of on the customer side. So the big wholesalers that the ladies and gentlemen on this call deal with on a regular basis, really have a lot of that market power. So anything you want to say about that particular sustainability issue for us?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Dan. And I would say that I would break the problem into two components. So component one is maybe the harder part, and component two is maybe the easier part from a think tank or policy point of view. And that is to say, the first part, which is when you're dealing with a vigorously competitive marketplace where the cost of manufacturing are relatively low and there's a kind of a commodity pricing element, you're going to have consolidation on the wholesaling side. That's just you see that in every business sector, right? So that's a hard problem to solve from an organic standpoint of there's going to be a natural centripetal force towards concentration in the distribution channel because you're dealing with commodity pricing. That's the hard part that I don't have any facile answers for you about. but maybe you've got some ideas on that, and I'd love to hear yours if you've got some. The part that's, I think, a little bit more approachable from a policy standpoint is, are there anti-competitive practices that these companies are engaging in, whether it's outright collusion or things that are more subtle, where you feel there are contractual terms where they're kind of throwing you over a barrel. That's the sort of stuff that the FTC and the DOJ, that's in their purview to address, right? So if there are things that are going on, and in Congress as well, right? So if there are things that are going on where the wholesalers are acting in a way that's anti-competitive, then by all means, I would love to get the details on that and write about it and bring that to the attention of policymakers, which of course you're obviously very capable of doing on your own without me, but I'm happy to amplify that.
So let's open it up. The next question is going to come from Mark Walensik. So Mark, you have a question on supply chain, then we'll go to Hillel Cohen. But Mark?
Sure. I would be interested in what Avik thinks about calls for an industrial policy for essential drugs and making a trade-off of encouraging U.S. manufacturing of some or many drugs, even at the cost of higher prices, to pay 2, 3, or 4 times more for drugs in order to have them made here, and whether or not that makes sense from his view, and how he would go about balancing those interests to have more reliability of the supply chain for at least a subset or certain drugs that might be a longer list than several hundred.
Yeah, the short answer is there's a lot of interest in that topic in Congress, and the price or cost point is not controversial, in the sense that I think for strategically important drugs, particularly off-patent strategically important drugs, the view is, the national security interests outweigh the market efficiency concern. So I don't think anybody, I shouldn't say anybody, but I'm not aware of anyone who's really objecting to that concept from a kind of ideological standpoint. I think people look at it like you're going through that period of time we were in the beginning of around this time last year, where there was a lot of concern about the supply chain. I think a lot of people took away from that conversation that we've got to do a better job of having stockpiles, obviously not just of the finished products, but of the APIs. And that's a thorny problem, right? Because the API situation is a lot harder to unwind. Really, it's more that than anything else. I mean, and it's not just the APIs, right? So the APIs, it's hard enough to get that to be more of a domestic industry. But then it's the raw materials that go into the APIs. There's even more concentration of raw materials for APIs in China, I understand. Again, you guys are the experts, so you tell me if I'm misstating anything here. But that's my understanding from talking to your colleagues. So I think that the will is there from a standpoint of Congress willing to put the money in. I think what I'm not yet clear on is, can we actually do it? Can we execute on the strategy? Can we actually build that infrastructure on the API and raw material side, particularly the raw material side, to actually decentralize those supply chains? I hope we can, but it seems to me it's going to be a 10-year project to get to a better place on that.
Great. Next, I'd like to go to Hillel Cohen.
Hi, thank you very much. Really very interesting. Very brief question. I was struck by the relatively small percentage of biosimilar sales compared to the originator biologics. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the long-term sustainability of the business, whether companies would feel there's enough ROI, whether they would move out. I mean, obviously my company in Sandoz is heavily invested, but things may change in the future and certainly may change for other companies. So what are your general thoughts about that?
Yeah, glad you brought that up. I mean, this is why getting the cost of biosimilar R&D down is so important. Not just the R&D in the sense of clinical trials and manufacturing, but the patent litigation and marketing costs, right? I mean, we've seen this with Lantus, for example. We've seen this with a lot of things, right? Where people get almost to the finish line and they end up pulling their drug from the U.S. market because of whether it's the patent stuff or it's the PBM stuff or what have you, where it just doesn't make any sense. So what we've done is we've created this market structure where the upfront cost and risk, right? Because you could spend $500 million and not end up making it to market. So that's a risk. And then if you're going to spend $500 million, you have to have a market that's big enough on a revenue basis, on a top line basis, to make it worth your while, right? So those are the two factors that really deeply concern me, is that, and they're all driven by the cost of that upfront investment. And again, I think if you get over that, like if you're developing, a new Lasta and it's a big enough market, you're okay with those costs because you're like, okay, it's a big enough market, I can get my piece of that, and there are barriers to entry for the other guys. So that seems like a nice business. But there are very few of those kinds of opportunities. Many of the opportunities for biosimilars are for, market opportunities from a top line branded standpoint that are sub $1 billion, right? They might be a $500 million market or a $300 million market annually, or a $700 million market in the US. And so when those markets are smaller, those upfront costs become prohibitive, right? So my thought is we've really got to work hard to bring those costs down. And part of that is we're basically living in this policy regime that was created by the PRCA scare from the 1990s. I think most of you are probably familiar with this, but in the event that some of you aren't, when J&J's EPREX, there was a situation where the EMEA asked J&J to manufacture EPREX, which was their erythropoietin, in a slightly different way without using human serum albumin, because that was considered a controversial ingredient in the EU for some reason. And the end result was the new version of EPREX was slightly immunogenic and basically created autoantibodies in a small proportion of patients. And all of a sudden they had pure red cell aplasia, which is really bad. All the red blood cells got wiped out. And this was terrible. And that's why we call it biosimilars and not generics, right? Because there's this emphasis from our incumbent friends on leaving people the impression that that biosimilars are not therapeutically identical to the incumbent products, even if they're manufactured in exactly the same conditions, with exactly the same genetic sequence and exactly the same manufacturing technique. So to me, that intellectual or educational hurdle is really important here. I mean, I'm fully aware of the fact that biologics are more complex molecules and there are subtleties to manufacturing, but that's true batch to batch with the incumbent manufacturer too. That's not merely about the incumbent versus the biosimilar. That's within an individual manufacturing facility, you'll see that variation. So it seems to me that we've got to have a more scientifically grounded, rational approach to the way we think about biosimilars as therapeutically substitutable. If we do that, we could reduce the R&D costs for generating biosimilars. We could also do more to reduce the manufacturing costs that are up front. One thing we proposed at FREOPP is, what if we gave like an upfront $50 million grant to new ventures that want to set up biosimilar manufacturing facilities as a way of reducing, as a kind of a one-time get your seed capital kind of thing, to get more manufacturers off the ground, but also create some cost discipline. Instead of paying for the whole manufacturing cost, pay for a fixed amount so that you have the incentive to maintain your cost discipline and innovate in terms of how you bring your manufacturing costs down, but to reduce that upfront cost and upfront risk so that we can get more players in the market. And then the patent piece is obviously really important. We've got to do something there to, again, create something that works more like the Orange Book system, so that a Sandoz is not kind of spending 20 years in a black box, not knowing what a judge is going to have to decide. So these are, again, the hard problems. But if we want to have a system in which competition is the answer, these are the problems we have to solve. And we're already seeing a certain corner of the policy community say, you know what, we're never going to get there. We're not going to fix these things. we're never going to make competition work when it comes to biologic, molecules, let alone for cell therapies and vaccines and all this other stuff coming down the pike. So let's just have price controls. Let's just say you get 10 years of exclusivity, or maybe you do the exclusivity on the composition of matter patent, and then once you're done, boom, we're just going to regulate the prices after that. That is an approach that you're hearing people say.
Leaving aside the Peter Bach argument that you just mentioned, is it possible from the perspective of a think tank person to make any of these changes without reopening BPCIA?
You definitely, it seems to me you'd have to open up BPC. Well, you wouldn't have, for certain areas, it depends on the payer situation, right? So if you're talking about a Medicare B drug, B as in boy, the kinds of things that the Trump administration was contemplating in terms of international reference pricing may be an alternate route to the same endpoint, right? So I wrote that piece that Erica alluded to earlier about what Medicare can learn from other countries. And one of the things we talk about, there's, some of the jurisdictions out there have done some really clever things. One of the countries that I highlighted in that report is Denmark, where what they do, as many of you may know, is they have this publicly auction price every 2 weeks that's on their website, where all the erythropoietins have to basically post their price, and the reimbursement rate is geared to the lowest bidder, and so the patient has to pay much of the excess cost from that lowest bid price, and the end result is robust price competition within a single payer healthcare system, right? So if we were to say that Medicare B prices, for example, would be pegged to countries that are using those kinds of techniques and their prices, that would be, you could do that through a regulatory mechanism without reopening BPCIA on the price side. But on the cost side, which I think was the premise of your original question, there you could do something, right? So the FDA, the BPCI Act, like the old Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, is relatively, it's not super prescriptive in terms of how the FDA designs these regulations, right? It says there needs to be trials on interchangeability and a couple other things that are specified in the statute. But broadly speaking, the statute leaves it up to the FDA to determine what the rules are. So you could have a situation where an FDA commissioner who's really reform-minded could take a closer look at this stuff and make some progress, particularly on the manufacturing piece and on the clinical trial piece. The patent piece, you could also, from a future-facing standpoint, if the USPTO were more intentional about the way it grants some of these patent trolling, method of use formulation type patents, or a tweak to the isomer or the quaternary structure of the protein or whatever it is, you could solve that from a forward standpoint for drugs that are where the patents are being issued or considered today. But for the Humiras of the world that are already out there, that won't work. The other piece that we could think about doing more on, and again, this is an area where I'd love to learn from all of you, those of you who tried to work in this area, is the opposition process. So one thing that we've done that's encouraging from a policy standpoint is we brought in the European-style patent opposition procedure in order to maybe clear out the thicket of some of those trolling type patents that aren't real intellectual property. But for whatever reason, the opposition process is not being widely used here. I know there's obviously been some cases that didn't succeed in court and things like that. But it seems to me if we could strengthen the opposition procedure, then we could nip some of these problems in the bud early on and reduce that upfront risk for biosimilar manufacturers.
All right, we're going to keep moving along. That's
I know that was a long answer. Sorry.
No, the biosimilars topic is a big issue and obviously important to everyone on this call. So we appreciate your work on that and insight. George Keefe has a question on complex generics. George from Teva. George? There he is.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. No, I'm just curious. First of all, thank you for the very thought-provoking presentation. I'm curious if you've looked at this idea of complex generics. I know you kind of divided the world into biologics and small molecule, but we sort of have this middle category of complex generics. where you have a lot of products that are not approved. Generics have not been approved. There's a tremendous opportunity for savings for the system. So I'm curious if you've looked at that in terms of ways of speeding those products to market or increasing competition.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a lot of my thinking on this topic, frankly, is inspired by many of the experiences that Teva has had, the long journey that Teva has had trying to build a competitor to Advair. I've written about that for various places. Because when I remember being sitting in the audience as Teva executives would say, like, we're trying, but here are all the hurdles that we're running into. And to give one example, and I guess Teva's a bit on both sides of that, right? Because Copaxone has been, in a sense, a beneficiary of some of those rules, you could say. So it's a very important problem to solve. And in my original the competition prescription white paper, we have a whole section on this topic, because it's an area where the FDA has had, you could say, a blind spot. Scott Gottlieb, as you know, has been very forward thinking on that topic when he was at the FDA, and it seems to me made a lot of progress in trying to reform some of those customs at the FDA, and how complex generics were developed and regulated by the agency. One thing that we've talked about and proposed is that addresses, well, there's some things you can do specifically around having a more specialized or dedicated pathway for complex generics, which we don't yet have, I don't think, but I know Scott has been talking about that to a degree, and we've been talking about that to a degree. Another area that, from a policy standpoint, that is of interest to me, that's more macro than complex generics, but complex generics are a subset, is the FDA's kind of scientific prejudice has been, we really want to fast track from a regulatory standpoint drugs for terminal diseases and for unmet medical needs. And our whole thing is, why shouldn't we also fast track drugs for medical needs, but where there's a single option, right? Because financial toxicity is a problem too. And so that second drug or that third drug, again, you all know these curves way better than I do. The price impact of that for the patient is so massive, and the affordability improvement is so massive that we should consider the second drug to market or the third drug to market, whether that's a branded or a generic, to be pretty material in terms of, that should be more of a priority for the FDA. The FDA, of course, is not supposed to consider price, but they can consider the number of competitors. That's kind of an indirect way of considering price, you could say. And that might be one way that both affects the complexity, the saga, the Iliad of the journey that Teva faced with its Advair competitors. That was just, that to me is if not the most egregious example. I mean, you think about all the money that GSK made because, drugs approved in 1988 were basically blocked from competition for all these years. I mean, it's just terrible, right? And so the more attention we can draw to that, the better, broadly speaking. And again, I'm interested in what your insights are. I mean, to take the Advair case specifically, because I think it's really instructive, the challenge, as I understood it from what I learned from your colleagues back in the day, was, to have a substitutable product, your PK/PD had to be identical to Advair, but to be identical to Advair and PK/PD, you're violating GSK's IP. So that was just kind of paradoxical. And it seems to me that what the FDA's regulatory standard should be clinical equivalence in those cases, maybe not PK/PD equivalence. And by creating a more clinical equivalence standard and dose equivalence standard, you can address some of these maybe unintended consequences of the way the FDA has thought about all this stuff. But again, I really welcome your feedback. We'd love to learn from you on that.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I'm glad you're looking at this and would welcome the opportunity to speak with you further about it.
Sure.
Hey, that's great. And we are, boom, right at time. The hour just flew by. Avik, that was fantastic. I would just like to thank you for joining us today. We're raising the bar every time we do one of these Allies, Thinkers, and Scribes sessions, but they're really great. Your points were right on target for everybody on this call today. So thank you very much, Avik.
Thanks, Dan. Best of luck to everybody. I really appreciate all the work you do.